Hello, students. Well, we've reached the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. As we get up into modern times, there's so much interesting material to cover that I'm afraid this lecture will also be quite lengthy. So you may want to take it in two parts, watch about half, and then take a break and come back later and watch the second half. Well, when Truman decided to step down and not run in the 1952 election, that left the field wide open. And for many Americans, the obvious choice was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had been the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He had been in charge of the D-Day invasion, and he was a national military hero. And military heroes often do very well in presidential elections. There have been several former generals who have served as president. It's quite interesting, though. Eisenhower had never shown the slightest interest in politics. In fact, nobody even knew what political party he belonged to. So actually, both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, approached Eisenhower, or Ike as he was generally known, and asked him to run. And so, after thinking about it, Eisenhower finally decided to run for the Democrats, and for the Republicans, excuse me. And so the Democrats nominated a politician from Illinois named Adlai E. Stevenson. Now, Stevenson was a very intelligent man. He was well educated, um, and sometimes he flaunted that a little bit too much. For instance, in one exchange, someone came up to Stevenson and told him that he would win the votes of all thinking people. And Stevenson's response was, "That's not enough. I need a majority." Well, Stevenson had a good sense of humor, but comments like that really didn't play well with voters. I mean, the voters didn't like what they perceived as his attitude of superiority. And so Stevenson was commonly portrayed in this election as an intellectual egghead, someone who was really too smart for his own good. Um, Eisenhower's vice presidential running mate was none other than Richard M. Nixon, making his first appearance on the national stage from California. Nixon had made a name for himself in the House of Representatives and then briefly in the Senate for his very hardline anti-communism. So he was considered to be quite right wing. Um, and it was Nixon who brought scandal to the campaign. Midway through the election season, Nixon was accused of having a slush fund, that is, a kind of secret stash of money that he had gotten from wealthy donors that he was using for his own purposes, violating the election laws. And so, to defend himself from this accusation, Nixon went on TV on September the 23rd, 1952, and delivered what came to be known as the Checkers speech. Why was it called the Checkers speech? Well, see for yourself. If you go to the supplementary videos folder and just click on the Checkers speech, you'll see a brief excerpt from the speech, and we'll talk more about it in just a moment. All right, well, what do you think? Would you buy a used car from that man? uh, so already Nixon in 1952 had a reputation for being somewhat untrustworthy, but really he played it off brilliantly, mentioning the little dog Checkers in an attempt to gain sympathy, which actually worked quite well. So the scandal died down. Eisenhower also used television very effectively. In fact, Eisenhower was the first presidential candidate to broadcast nationwide campaign commercials. So, if you're sick of commercials already for the presidential election, you have Eisenhower to thank for that. Well, Eisenhower's inaugural address was in some ways quite similar to Truman's inaugural address, which Group 1 is reading this time. He announced, quote, "We who are free must proclaim anew our faith. This faith is the abiding creed, that is religion, of our fathers. It is our faith in the deathless dignity of man, governed by eternal moral and natural laws. This faith defines our full view of life. It establishes beyond debate those gifts of the Creator that are man's inalienable rights, and that make all men equal in his sight. The enemies of this faith know no God but force. Freedom is pitted against slavery, lightness against the dark." Well, strong language there, and it's not language that we're used to hearing from presidents in the last 30 years or so, but it was quite commonplace in that time for presidents to appeal to faith, to religion. And in this speech, Eisenhower is using that in a way as a debating point against the communists, who he refers to as the enemies of this faith, who know no God but force. And what he's referring to is that communism was officially an atheistic ideology, that good communists were not supposed to believe in God or have any religious faith. And so by referring to faith and religion so often, American political leaders were trying to distance themselves from communism and claiming to be the leaders or the protectors of religion in the free world. And on the surface, it looked like in the 50s that Americans were more religious than they had ever been before. In fact, by 1960, 69% of Americans claimed to be full members of a church or synagogue, and that was the highest total ever recorded, higher by far than the estimates for the 19th century, for instance. One of the most popular television shows in the new craze for TV was called Life is Worth Living, and this show basically consisted of a Catholic bishop, Fulton J. Sheen, looking into the camera and giving a sermon. That was it, and this show was wildly popular. So you might think that Americans really had become extremely religious during the 50s. The truth, as always, is a little bit more complex than that. As we see from a famous quote by Ike, when he said that the United States must be grounded on, quote, "a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is," end quote. Now, that seems to affirm religion and faith, but if you think about it, churches traditionally had cared very much what people believed, and most churches had thought they were the true religion and that other religions were false and so forth. So what we're seeing here in a way is a kind of new sort of religion that allows a greater degree of choice, that isn't really very concerned with dogmas or doctrines. It was more a way of being, I guess you could say, in America in the 1950s. That really wasn't about what religion had pushed traditionally. And in many ways, really, people had turned away from old traditions. For example, many of the young parents during the baby boom era rejected the child rearing methods that their parents had used with them back during the Depression, and had adopted a more open and somewhat gentle approach. Many young parents during this period were influenced by a really epoch-making book called The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, that was written by a medical doctor named Benjamin Spock. Not to be confused with Mr. Spock from Star Trek. Actually, the Spock character in Star Trek was named after Benjamin Spock because the creators of the show really admired him. Well, a lot of people read this book. It was a huge bestseller, and in many ways, the baby boom generation was brought up according to the teachings of Dr. Spock. And what were those teachings? Well, Spock said that parents should not be authoritarian. They should not focus on discipline so much as loving their children, listening to them, encouraging them to express their feelings and not getting upset when children express themselves. So it was really much more about affirmation than it was about control or discipline. And so what you have with the baby boom generation is a huge number of people that are being raised in a totally new way, um, encouraged to express themselves, encouraged to be in touch with their feelings, and the results of that we shall see when we get to the lecture on the 1960s. But for now, I also want to mention that a lot of adults became very interested in popular books of psychology, and the idea that the purpose of life was something called self actualization. In other words, discovering your true self, discovering who you really were. Again, getting in touch with your feelings, getting to know yourself, and expressing yourself, and so forth. And again, this was something new. If you think about life during the Depression, people really didn't have time to examine their feelings. When you're desperately trying to survive and you don't know where the next meal is coming from, you really don't have time to worry about your feelings. So in a way, this was a luxury that was allowed by the prosperity of the post-World War II era. And this whole way of thinking was very much expressed in the music of the time. If you think of the emergence of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, and so forth, also the movies of the period. The film icon James Dean, that you see on the left here, who tragically died very young, in 1955 starred in a film called Rebel Without a Cause, in which he portrayed a teenager who was trying to find himself, who really didn't know who he was, and who was a very rebellious teenager, not for any particularly good reason. He didn't have a particularly rough life. That's why he was a rebel without a cause. But there was just this sense that people had to go through this phase of questioning, of rebelling, and trying to find out who they really were. Part of this had to do with the whole experience of World War II, because Hitler had really discredited the whole idea that people should be obedient, that they should obey some kind of powerful authoritarian leader. And so people in the 50s turned away from the idea of an authoritarian personality and embraced the idea that people should be individuals, free to embrace themselves and who they really were. And as part of this, it's quite interesting, many people believe that the sexual revolution did not get underway until the 1960s. But a few years ago, a historian named Alan Petney, who unfortunately died in an accident recently, came out with a book called The Permissive Society, in which he documented that, as a matter of fact, the rate of teenage pregnancy or single motherhood had gone up quite a bit from 1940 to 1960, from 3.6 babies born to single mothers per 1,000 women in 1940 to 9.2 in 1960, which strongly suggests that people are having more premarital sex. It's interesting, too, that although most women were homemakers, they were staying at home raising children, during the 1950s that um, the idea that the husband was the head of the family and that the husband had the final say in all major decisions was beginning to erode in the 50s. And women, many of whom were contributing with their jobs that they had on the side to the household income, were encouraged to make more decisions, especially about what kind of products to buy, where to live, and so forth. But already in the late 40s and 50s, you have some women who begin to rebel against the constraints of life as a housewife. And group 3, you're going to have a very interesting reading from a lady named Edith Stern, who in 1949 came out with a sort of blistering attack on the whole lifestyle of the housewife. And I think you'll find that quite interesting. Um, all right, well, I mentioned rock and roll a couple minutes ago. And I want you to listen to a song by the great rock and roll pioneer, singer songwriter Chuck Berry, who, by the way, is still alive. I think he's 89, living in St. Louis and still playing gigs now and then. Chuck Berry came out with a song called C'est la vie, which means that's life in French. And it's in French because he's talking about Cajun people in Louisiana. And I think this is a great song that really expresses, in a way, the whole essence of 1950s culture in America. So if you would go to the supplemental videos and watch the YouTube video C'est la vie, the pictures aren't important, but I just want you to hear the song. Okay, welcome back. Well, hope you like that. Here's some of the lyrics to the song. And again, sometimes I wish we were in the classroom so that I could ask you for your interpretation. But I think if you look at these lyrics, you see that, well, first of all, this is a song about a young couple that has gotten married, and they seem to be very happy together. But if you look at the lyrics, the reason they're happy doesn't seem to be so much because they love each other as because they have a whole lot of stuff. It says that Pierre, the husband, found some work and a little money, worked out well, and clearly they're using this new post-World War II prosperity to buy things. They get a coolerator, which is another name for a refrigerator. They're buying lots of TV dinners. This was a new luxury of the period, that you could heat up in the oven without having to cook. They have a phonograph, hi-fi, and they have hundreds and hundreds of records that they're listening to. They even have a new car, Cherry Red 53. So what I like about the song is the way that it describes the whole consumer culture of the 50s, and the fact that, once again, after the sacrifices of the 30s and 40s, people were ready for something new. They were ready to enjoy the good life of materialism. But there were dark clouds on the horizon as the Cold War continued to simmer on. And the Cold War really took a giant leap forward to a new phase in late 1952, when the United States carried out the first test of a new type of nuclear weapon called the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb. The hydrogen bomb was made not by nuclear fission like the A-bomb that we dropped on Japan, but nuclear fusion, and this unleashed really terrifying power. The H-bomb we tested in 52 was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb we dropped on Hiroshima. So it just so happened we did this test on a little chain of islands in the South Pacific that we owned, and specifically on the island of Illujalab. We moved all the people off first to other places in the Pacific, but detonated the bomb on a Luja lab, and it just so happened that a Hollywood camera crew was there to record the test. And when the test had been completed, this video was played on American TV stations throughout the country. So I want you to go to the supplementary videos folder and watch the H-bomb test video, and then we'll talk about it some more. Well, it's really extraordinary, and I think there are many different reactions that are possible to this. Some Americans saw this and no doubt felt very pleased and excited to be part of a country that had such awesome military power. Some people were probably impressed with the beauty of it in a kind of frightening way, certainly very beautiful images, or were interested in the science, the scientific aspect of it. But other Americans certainly were frightened by the potential for destruction that the H-bomb brought with it. As the U.S. moved into what became known as the thermonuclear age, pretty soon it was apparent that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which quite soon afterwards got its own H-bomb, had enough nuclear weapons potential to destroy civilization as we know it. And so people did worry quite a bit about the possible repercussions of this. And the government launched a new initiative from the Civil Defense Agency to try to get people to prepare for the event of nuclear war. I remember when I was a kid, in the 70s even, that late, we would have nuclear war drills in school, and that meant we would go out to the hall, we would squat down and put our head between our knees, kind of like a tornado drill. I never really understood how this was supposed to protect us from nuclear attack or radioactive fallout, but we did it anyway, and I think people do things sometimes just for reassurance, not because it's really effective. Another big fad in the 50s and 60s was for people to stock their basement with water and other supplies, food, canned food that they would need in case a nuclear war happened, or sometimes they would even dig bomb shelters in their backyard where they would store those things, where they planned to go and hide out in case a nuclear war happened. But tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union did decrease somewhat in mid-1953 when a truce was finally reached in the Korean conflict, and a ceasefire was proclaimed. It's interesting that no official peace treaty was ever signed, and therefore technically the two countries of North Korea and South Korea still remain at war. And of course North Korea is still governed by a communist dictatorship currently led by the wacky Kim Jong-un, and there's still a tremendous amount of tension between communist North Korea and our ally South Korea. But in 1953 the war did end. Also in 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and that brought a new era to the Soviet Union. There was a period of sort of struggle for power among the communist elite, and finally the man who emerged to replace Stalin was named Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev, in some ways, was really a breath of fresh air. He appeared in 1956 at a Congress of the Communist Party and gave a very famous speech called the Secret Speech, in which he denounced Stalin for all kinds of horrible crimes against humanity. He exposed how Stalin had executed millions of people with just the semblance of a trial, sent so many people to the concentration camps in Siberia, and so forth. And So certainly no one would have dared to do that before. Um, so under Khrushchev, for a while, you see a new climate of more openness in the USSR. Khrushchev relaxed the censorship of the media somewhat and allowed some more discussion of issues to take place, and also reduced the number of prosecutions of people that were political dissidents in the Soviet Union. But this Soviet thaw only went so far. And we see that also in 1956 when the Hungarians, encouraged by this new openness, decided to rebel against their Soviet puppet masters. And Khrushchev wasn't going to allow that, so he sent in the tanks. They rolled into Budapest and crushed this Hungarian uprising of 1956. But the new, more friendly climate allowed for some high-level meetings between U.S. and Soviet leaders. For example, Vice President Nixon went to Moscow in 1959, and that laid the groundwork for Khrushchev to come to the United States and meet with Ike in September of 1959. However, early in the 1950s, the attacks on communists in this country heated up, again instigated by Senator Joseph McCarthy, trying to root out communists in the government and in other industries. This is sometimes called red baiting because the color of communism is red. And there were also blacklists in certain industries. For instance, in Hollywood, there was a blacklist of stars and writers and directors who supposedly were communists, and there were quite a few of these people who couldn't get work for a number of years in Hollywood, like, for instance, Charlie Chaplin, who was accused of being a communist. But McCarthy went too far in 1954 when he accused the U.S. military of harboring secret communists. I'll just mention that McCarthy's nickname that he cultivated was Tail Gunner Joe because as a Marine, he had gone up on some missions during World War II as an observer in bomber aircraft. Later turned out he had totally inflated the number of missions he had gone on in order to get a medal. But Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy attacked the Army, and that was a huge mistake. Eisenhower refused to cooperate and refused to release any records to the committee that McCarthy had formed to investigate this matter. This is called executive privilege when the president refuses to release important documents that he or she, perhaps very soon, believes that will compromise national security. Well, the Army McCarthy hearings that followed were a complete disaster for McCarthy, and he really looked like a fool for making these allegations. And the ultimate result of them was that McCarthy himself was censured by the Senate. That is, they passed a resolution saying that he had behaved inappropriately. And from that moment, McCarthy's power really began to wane, and within a few years, he had drunk himself to death. The end of McCarthyism. And so, in spite of McCarthy's efforts, the politics of the national security establishment, led by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, continued in much the same way as they had under Truman. It really didn't matter whether you had a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. Our foreign policy was the same, trying to build alliances with other countries in order to contain communism and prevent it from expanding, and also building up our nuclear weapons arsenal in order to intimidate the Soviet Union. And this was very much a conscious strategy. The idea was that if we built up our nuclear arsenal to the point that the Soviets knew we could annihilate their society, or perhaps even destroy the entire world civilization, that the Soviets would never dare to attack us. This idea was called deterrence, or sometimes mutually assured destruction. Just the unthinkableness of the destruction caused by nuclear war would deter people from ever fighting. And that may seem like a barbaric idea, and in some ways it was, but it must be said that deterrence, thus far, really has prevented a nuclear war. We haven't had one since World War II, and like I said before, the US and the Soviets never actually went to war during the Cold War. So perhaps, arguably, this idea of deterrence or mutually assured destruction did have some good effect. Well, turning to another issue in foreign policy, a crisis that erupted in 1956 over the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is in Egypt. It had been built in the 19th century by the French and the British, and in the 50s, the British owned it. But the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in July 1956 said that it was time for the British to leave, that Egypt was going to nationalize the canal and take it over for their own interests. Well, the British didn't want to do that. And so, together, the British and the French approached Israel and convinced them to invade the canal zone so that they would have an excuse to then bring their troops in to quote unquote restore order. And so they executed this plan. Now, of course, Britain and France are both key members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They are important allies of the United States. And so the British and the French really expected Eisenhower to come to help them. But Eisenhower surprised everybody by refusing to give any support whatsoever to the British and French invasion of the canal. He was furious that the British had done this without consulting him. And not only did he withdraw all support, he actually joined the Soviets in demanding that the British and the French evacuate and withdraw from the Suez Canal zone. So, what I did during the Suez Crisis really set an important new direction in the world. The message was the United States is no longer interested in helping great colonial empires like Britain and France keep their colonies. And so after Suez, many more colonies in Africa and Asia became free and independent from their European imperial masters. And so we call this process decolonization, in which many countries throughout the world became free and independent. And why would Ike do this? Well, partly because we got our independence from an imperial power, Britain, so in a sense it was part of our tradition as Americans, but also because it suited our Cold War interests. If we could detach these places from their European masters, we could make them our friends and allies, and we could try to win them over to our side. And of course, the Soviets had the same thing in mind. So as decolonization progressed, the Cold War attempt to gain more and more allies by both superpowers heated up. The most famous example of this, of course, is Vietnam. Now, in 1954, a Vietnamese leader named Ho Chi Minh got an army together. He was a communist leader, by the way. Got an army together and had a battle with the French, who owned Vietnam at that time, at a place called Dien Bien Phu. And Ho's forces soundly defeated the French. And so that convinced the French that they really had to get out of Vietnam. And so they left. By 1956, the French had abandoned Vietnam. And who do you think then got the responsibility of stepping in um, to keep all of Vietnam from going communist? Well, it was the United States, of course. And so we began to send military advisors to Vietnam to protect the part of Vietnam that did not go communist, that is South Vietnam, and to try to keep it from going communist as North Vietnam had done. Why did we do this? Well, it had to do with an idea called the famous domino theory. Now, you've probably all played the game with dominoes where you line them up one after the other in a row, and then you push down the first domino at one end, and what happens? They all come tumbling down. Well, the idea of the domino theory was that if you let even one country go communist, and all the other countries in that region would follow. They would topple down like dominoes. And so you had to dig in your heels and not let any country anywhere go communist. So that was the logic behind our intervention in Vietnam, which of course would escalate with very drastic consequences in the 60s and 70s. By the way, I want to mention Group 2. You're reading is a document from the National Security Council that was very important in terms of this whole Cold War mentality of containment and our strategy in dealing with the Soviet Union during the 1950s. Well, the thaw didn't really last very long, and by the latter part of Eisenhower's administration, tensions were increasing again, partly because of technological advance the Soviets had made in 1957. On October 4th, the Soviets launched a man-made satellite that orbited the Earth for the first time. This was called Sputnik. And this was a real humiliation for the United States that the Soviets had gotten into outer space before we did. And we were also afraid, of course, that if the Soviets won the space race, then they might find a way to launch missiles from outer space and destroy us. And so there was a sudden push in this country for more science education, more math education, trying to build up our technological skills. And also there was a great deal more funding for scientific research in universities, trying to beat the Soviets into outer space. Another low point of the Cold War came in September 1959 when Khrushchev made a famous speech talking about the free world when he said, quote, "We will bury you," end quote. Shortly thereafter came the famous U2 incident. Yes, the rock group did name themselves after this episode. The U2 was a spy plane that we were using to conduct surveillance in Soviet airspace. And so we flew missions over the Soviet Union. But on May 1st, 1960, one of our U-2 spy planes that was piloted by a man named Francis Gary Powers was shot down, crash landed in the Soviet Union. Powers survived, and he was taken into custody and interrogated. And this went on for a couple of years. And so basically Khrushchev was able to expose the fact that the United States government had been conducting illegal surveillance according to international law in their airspace. Well, Eisenhower confessed that in fact we had been doing that, but there was really no way to defuse the tension that this incident caused, which by the way was captured in a recent film called Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks, if you're interested. And so Ike's final summit meeting with Khrushchev was pretty much derailed by the U-2 incident. And Eisenhower decided to step down, or he had to step down in 1960 because by this time the amendment had been passed limiting presidents to 2 terms. And so he went before the nation on TV and gave a very, very famous speech, his farewell address. And the really famous sentence in this speech is the first one you see here on the screen. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military industrial complex. What is he talking about? What is the military industrial complex? Well, if you think about it, um, someone had to make all these nuclear weapons and spy planes and so forth that we were producing. And obviously, they were being made by U.S. corporations like Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and other corporations that are supplying war material to our military. And that means that a lot of people had a vested interest in continuing the nuclear arms race. You know, if, say, we had signed a treaty with the Soviets, destroying all nuclear weapons and promising not to make any more, a whole lot of corporations would have lost profits and a whole lot of workers would have been out of a job. So what Ike is really saying here is that industry and the military have become a very powerful special interest group working together to possibly promote war and to promote the arms race. And he says the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Well, what's the answer to this problem? How can American citizens keep their government from being hijacked by this powerful special interest group? He says in the second paragraph, there's only one thing that can help us: an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. In other words, the citizens, we, the citizens ourselves, have to take responsibility for keeping an eye on our government and making sure that government decisions are really based on the common good of everybody, rather than on the interests of people who want to make money off weapons. This was really shocking to a lot of people who couldn't believe that Eisenhower, who after all had been such an important general and military commander, would actually say this. And in fact, you can see that really Ike was probably the only man in America in 1961 who could get away with saying this because of his military achievements. And so it was really, really a brave and very surprising move by Eisenhower as he left office in 1961. Another difficult image here, but again, it's one I think we need to see, and I'll explain what this means. As we shift into another very important topic, the civil rights movement during the 1950s. One of the catalysts for the civil rights movement was the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till lived in Chicago. He was 14 years old in 1954. And in 1955, his mother, who was from Mississippi, decided to send him down to visit her relatives in Mississippi because she wanted him to be in touch with his roots and his family. And so Till came down to the South, but obviously things in Chicago were quite a bit freer for African Americans than they were in Mississippi. And one day, Till did something that in Chicago might have been normal, but in Mississippi was life-threatening. And that is, he went into a grocery store and he whistled at the white woman who was working at the counter. That night, her husband and her brother-in-law showed up at Till's house. They kidnapped him, they dragged him out into the woods, into a swamp. They beat him to death, and they left his body floating there. And it was missing for several days, till finally Emmett Till's body was recovered and shipped to Chicago for the funeral. And Emmett Till's mother, Mamie, insisted on having an open casket funeral so that the entire world could see what had happened to Emmett Till in Mississippi. So the photographs were spread around the world, shocked many people. And so this brutal lynching of Emmett Till really got people to thinking about the conditions for blacks in the South under Jim Crow, especially after the men who murdered Emmett Till were found not guilty by an all-white jury in Mississippi. The Civil Rights Movement won a great victory in the courts, obviously, in 1954 with the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. This had to do with a family in Topeka, Kansas, who wanted their daughter to go to the all-white public school there. And so the case made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice Earl Warren, on May 17, 1954, handed down the famous decision which said that segregated public schools were unconstitutional. But that did not mean that segregation would immediately be eliminated, because a later case shortly thereafter, called Brown 2, had a very interesting sentence in the decision. The Supreme Court said that integration should be carried out, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote. And if you think about what deliberate means, yes, doing something freely of your own free will, but it also implies that you do it kind of slowly and carefully. And so the language was confusing, but it really gave Southern schools an excuse to delay integration for a number of years. As a matter of fact, by 1964, only 2% of blacks in the former Confederate States were actually attending integrated public schools. So very deliberate indeed. Another very important moment in the Civil Rights Movement, obviously, the famous bus boycott in Montgomery in 1955 and 1956, that was triggered by Rosa Parks, of course. Rosa Parks was sitting in the fourth row from the back of a segregated bus, city bus in Montgomery, and so she was in the black section. The problem was that if the white section was full and people were standing up, the bus drivers would ask blacks to stand up instead and give the white people their seats in the black section. And that's what the driver asked Rosa Parks to do. She refused and was arrested, was fingerprinted. And so the Montgomery bus boycott was born. It's interesting. We don't really know this for sure, but Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. The president of the NAACP in Montgomery was a man named Edie Nixon. He was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, important black labor union. And it's possible that Nixon had talked to Rosa Parks about the possibility of doing this beforehand, that they were looking for kind of a test case to challenge segregation. Again, it's not clear, but for whatever reason, Rosa Parks did resist, and it just so happened that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was serving in his first pastorate in a church there in Montgomery, and so he emerged as the leader of a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association, which called for a boycott by the African American community against the Montgomery bus system. And the way this worked was that people who had cars in the black community organized carpools, so they would drive around the city picking up people and taking them to work so they wouldn't have to ride the bus. But if you couldn't get a ride, you had to walk. So every day you would see many African Americans walking to work in Montgomery, and it's kind of a famous quote. A reporter approached a black woman who was walking to work and asked her how she felt. Wasn't she tired having to walk to work day after day? And she replied, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. Um, and I think that quote is interesting because it really points to the spiritual element of the civil rights movement, that reference to the soul. The heart and soul of the civil rights movement was the black church. And a lot of the resistance was planned and executed from black churches. Also, another spiritual element had to do with the teachings of the Indian resistance leader Mohandas K. Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi, as he's called, which King had studied and agreed with. The idea that resistance was more effective if it was nonviolent. If, for instance, people committed acts of civil disobedience, that meant disobeying unjust laws in order to make a point and being willing to take the consequences by going to jail. And so you see that philosophy of Gandhi during the bus boycott, even though Martin Luther King's house was actually firebombed during the boycott, he responded nonviolently. And when he was arrested under a city ordinance that prohibited interfering with the operation of a business, King willingly went to jail, and he spent 2 weeks in jail. Now, why was this so effective? As we'll see as the civil rights movement unfolds, it called attention to the situation of blacks in the South. It attracted media attention, especially if there were large mass arrests of African Americans. People knew something was going on and came to investigate and broadcast images of African Americans being arrested, walking to work, and so forth. These were powerful tactics to try to arouse sympathy for the civil rights movement. And they paid off in November of 1956 when the United States Supreme Court struck down the ordinance in Alabama which segregated buses in that state. And so the Montgomery bus system then had to integrate, and a great victory was won in the Montgomery boycott. All right, finally, an even more tense episode in the civil rights movement took place in 1957 in the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, which still had not, like most schools in the South, had not integrated its public schools. Eisenhower really was not that interested in helping the civil rights movement integrate the schools. In fact, on one occasion, he told the Chief Justice Earl Warren, talking about white Southerners who were dragging their feet on integration, quote, "These are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit alongside some big overgrown Negroes," end quote. I shouldn't laugh. That's a shocking comment for a president to make, but it gives you a sense of the kind of apathy that the civil rights leaders had to deal with from public officials. But events in Little Rock really forced Eisenhower's hand. There were 9 African American students who wanted to enroll in Central High School, previously all-white school in Little Rock. And the governor of Arkansas, a man named Orville Faubus, actually called out the National Guard to block those 9 students from entering the school. And so every day, those students would show up at the school, and they would face a cheering, or really a mocking and jeering crowd of mostly white supremacists, yelling threats at them as they approached the school, and then they would be turned away by the National Guard. And images and video and pictures of what was going on in Little Rock obviously were splashed all over the media throughout the country and the world. And eventually Eisenhower decided he had to act, that this was a real embarrassment to the United States. And so on September 25th, 1957, Ike sent the 101st Airborne Division into Little Rock, and ordered them to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school and to monitor them to protect them from threats so that the school would be integrated. And that is what happened. So, for the first time, a president intervened forcefully to support the cause of civil rights. Why did Ike do this? Well, it had a lot to do with the Cold War. He said, quote, "Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation," end quote. What does that mean? Well, our enemies, the communists, are using this as propaganda against the U.S. That we're a country where 9 young people who just want to get an education are threatened and treated brutally. And so Eisenhower felt if the United States was going to retain its credibility as leader of the free world, he had to step in Little Rock. Important precedent for future action, as we shall see when we move on to the 1960s in the next module.